Quick disclaimer. This video discusses mature-rated TV shows. A list of topics, themes, and subject matter will be included in the video description. All clips used are owned by AMC and are not my own. This video is commentary, is transformative, and falls under fair use. That being said, I highly suggest watching The Walking Dead prior to this video if you haven't already, or at least have a baseline knowledge, as I will be making direct references to important characters, plot points, and seasons of the series throughout. So, spoiler warning for The Walking Dead, The Ones Who Live, The Walking Dead World Beyond, and The Walking Dead graphic novel series. You have been warned.
Ken, aka Ricky Dicky Doodog Rhymes.
Throughout The Walking Dead, the main character Rick Grimes has faced many near-death experiences over the run of the show. However, there has always been one that rubbed fans of the series the wrong way. How did Rick survive his initial coma in the first episode? To recap, Officer Rick Grimes is shot and gravely injured during a shootout, which winds him up in a coma for about a month. Unfortunately, while he was in the coma, the zombie apocalypse started, leaving him to wake up alone in Harrison Memorial Hospital with no idea of what happened. With how abandoned the hospital looks when Rick wakes up, many fans have questioned how he could have survived that long in such a brutal environment. Well, I'm here to ask, what if he didn't? What if Rick Grimes died in that hospital bed all those years ago? How would it affect his family and the group who he helped lead through the apocalypse? Whether it be due to a flatline, roaming walker, or bullets from a pie-passing military, this story begins with Rick Grimes not making it out of the hospital.
Did you take one of my protein bars?
We'll start with Morgan and Dwayne. I see this playing out very badly for these two. Since they never met Rick, they were never able to gather all those guns from the police station. I believe that Dwayne would still be bitten by his mother while on a run, since Morgan was not able to take her out. Dwayne's death would still lead to Morgan's inevitable insanity, but since Rick never gave him the walkie-talkie, Morgan would have very little to hold on to, most likely getting taken out by raiders or walkers sometime down the line. Back in the Atlanta camp, I see things falling apart much sooner. We know from Daryl that his and Merle's original plan was to raid the group for supplies and be on their way surviving together. After the two of them sneak away with a large portion of the group's supplies, this puts the group into a terrible situation. The group ends up going on more runs, scavenging in the city, risking their lives more frequently. This situation, on top of intergroup conflict, such as Carol's abusive husband Ed, would cause Shane to take it upon himself to protect Lori and Carl, and leave before he thought it was too late. Since Shane was one of the few in the Atlanta camp who knew how to fight, unfortunately, I don't see the rest of the group surviving very long. Maybe the group would all pile into Dale's RV and find their way to the CDC or something. However, that's unlikely, as the only reason they were allowed in was due to Rick's persistence with Dr. Jenner. Despite that, even if Dr. Jenner did allow the group to stay, since the timer would have already been counting down at the time of their arrival, and since Carol wouldn't have had the hand grenade on her from washing Rick's clothes, there would be no way out for the group. And as we know, the CDC, along with all the information on the wildfire virus, would be no more. Because of this, it wouldn't be until much later that Shane or the others find out what Dr. Jenner whispered to Rick, which was that everyone is infected. Without interference, Herschel and the Greene family would most likely continue to live on the farm in blissful ignorance, filling up the barn with walkers in hope for a cure that never comes. At some point, I believe Daryl and Merle would make their way to the group known as The Living. With supplies dwindling in the nearby town, they'd probably begin raiding nearby farms too. But as we know, Herschel is not afraid to defend his family and home if it comes down to it. So any conflict from The Living towards the Greenes would most likely end in a big commotion, which I think could lead to the barn being opened, releasing the walkers. With both the Greenes and the Livings being way too in over their heads, I see most, if not all of them, being taken out by the horde of barn walkers. But for the sake of the story, we'll say that Daryl and Merle make it out alive, and flee before they end up getting themselves killed. After that, I believe Daryl and Merle would find their way to the governor, who at this point would have been running Woodbury with little to no complications along the way. The Dixon brothers would become valued members of the community. At this point, I think Michonne would have come across Woodbury as well, but since she never had the chance to get close to Andrea, I don't see Michonne ever giving the governor a chance. Most likely just continuing as a nomad of sorts for some time.
No.
If the prisoners inside the prison don't starve by this point, they'd almost definitely die to the first walkers they encounter, since they have no concept of the new world. Without Rick's group of the prison to clear it out, Tyrese and Sasha's group would most likely have died attempting to break their way into the prison.
You mean me?
By this point, Shane would most likely plan to take Laurie and Carl to where he originally wanted to go in the show, Fort Benning, because he thinks it'll be a well-secured military base. Upon finding it overrun, he'd most likely backtrack, possibly running into someone like Aaron, thereby leading Shane and his self-proclaimed family to Alexandria. With Alexandria's large quantity of medical supplies, I believe Laurie would most likely survive any complications with childbirth. This means Carl would not have to shoot Laurie in order to prevent her from turning. You may think Carl would be a much weaker survivor because of this, since Laurie's death was what truly toughened him up. But I don't believe Carl would be weak in the slightest. We see early on that Shane shows all characteristics of a survivor. The group just wasn't ready for it yet. So I believe Carl would turn out to be an incredible survivor alongside Shane. Maybe a little more hot-headed or brash, but by no means would Carl be a bad survivor. I also believe Laurie would become a much stronger survivor as well, similar to a Season 3 Carol, something we never got to see with Laurie's character in the main series. And baby Judith would be raised in Alexandria from birth rather than in the prison. Much like Rick, I don't think Shane would put up with Alexandria's lack of survival skills. However, since Shane still has Laurie in his life, he never would have been interested in Jessie like Rick was. Meaning Pete would continue to abuse Jessie and her kids behind closed doors, unless Shane ended up finding out, and as we know from Carol and Ed, Shane does not take too lightly to abusive husbands, ironically. Much like what happened with Rick at Alexandria, and what happened with Shane at Herschel's farm in the show, I believe it wouldn't be long before Shane shows Deanna and the rest of the Alexandrians that it's not safe to be naive, leading Shane to take over, much like Rick's Ricktatorship.
I'm tainted meat.
By this point, the group will have completely skipped over the events of Season 4 and 5 in relation to Terminus. Terminus will most likely continue to cannibalize any nearby people, including Father Gabriel if he didn't already starve himself in his own church. Abraham, Rosita, and Eugene would most likely continue their way to Washington, and I believe as long as there were no fatal complications along their journey, I don't think Eugene would ever tell the others that he was lying about Washington. And if he did, Abraham would almost certainly have killed him for blatantly lying to the group.
And I fed him spaghetti.
Shane and the Alexandrians would meet Jesus by this point. When they make it to Hilltop, Gregory gives them the same proposition he gave Rick. Shane, at this point in the story, would be a near carbon copy of how Rick was, so in an attempt to protect his family, he agrees to take out the survivors' outpost. After some drawn-out back and forth, with some occasional psychological torment from the Saviors, Shane, Laurie, Carl, Aaron, and others find themselves in the lineup to meet the Saviors. However, instead of Negan stepping out of the RV, we see a familiar face. Michonne steps out, Lucille in hand, ready to kill someone. We know from Michonne's drug trip thanks to Virgil that if it wasn't for meeting Andrea, Michonne most likely would have become a savior down the line. Regardless of who they kill here, I don't see Shane breaking in the same way Rick did. As we know, Shane is very hot-headed. I think Shane would lash out, similar to how Daryl did, but in a much more damaging way.
You're a hero with a shit haircut.
Sometime after this, Alexandria and Hilltop would come in contact with Anne and her group, the Scavengers. Assuming that all goes to plan, Anne would do her best to try to get someone from Shane's group as a form of bartering or fulfilling her deal with the CRM. I see the rest of the story playing out very similarly to how it did in canon. Shane would find a way to take out the Whisperers if he ever came in contact with them, but with the rest of the characters we know being dead or in some other community, it's hard to speculate what may happen from here. Maybe sometime down the line, Shane would get picked up by the CRM, similar to how Rick did, and Laurie would be the one to go find him, while Carl stays at Alexandria to raise Judith. That is, only if the CRM does not identify Shane's group as a threat and wipes them out beforehand, as we see they have a tendency to do in The Ones Who Live and World Beyond. Following that former train of thought, if Shane made it to the CRM, similar to Rick, I believe it wouldn't be long before Shane attempts his first escape. We know Shane is very brash with decision-making, and I could see him not fully thinking through a plan and getting himself and/or Laurie killed along the way, ending his arc very abruptly, unlike Rick and Michonne throughout The Ones Who Live. With Shane and Laurie now gone, that would leave Carl to run the community on his own. Or maybe he'd get to grow old, similar to what we see of the graphic novels.
We ain't The Walking Dead.
This is all to show that without Rick being lucky enough to wake up in the hospital when he did, regardless of how he did, single-handedly saved so many lives and impacted countless others. Rick Grimes' story is a perfect example of the butterfly effect, and although I think there were ups and downs to the story itself, I adore The Walking Dead and its cause and effect style of storytelling. It's always fun to step back from the media you enjoy and ask a few what-ifs, to give you a new appreciation for the decisions that were made. If you have any other topics you want me to cover in a future video, Walking Dead or otherwise, let me know in the comments. I'd love to make another video like this. Thanks for watching.